The riders came down the ridge slowly, their horses kicking up dust that shimmered in the dying light. Sarah's heart pounded as she gripped her child tighter, the baby sensing her fear and fussing against her breast. She had seen these men before, their smirks carved deep in her memory, their boots on her porch as they stripped her of dignity. Now they rode as though the prairie itself belonged to them, and the sight of their sneers turned her knees weak. But before panic could overtake her, she heard the heavy tread of John Carver's boots behind her. He stepped onto the porch like a shadow of the land itself, broad and silent, hat low over his eyes. He said nothing at first, only rested a hand on the rail as the riders drew closer. Sarah could feel the tension rolling off him, not wild or reckless but steady, like a storm that knows its power. One of the brothers, Eli, the cruelest, leaned forward in his saddle and spat into the dust, grinning wide. "Didn't take you long, widow," he drawled. "Already tucked up with the rancher. Ain't decent." Sarah flushed with shame, but John did not move. His voice came low, calm, and cold enough to bite. "Careful how you talk in front of a lady." The men laughed, but the sound faltered at the edges. They had expected a broken woman, not a man who stood like iron at her side. Eli's smile twitched, but he pressed on. "That land you sit on ain't hers. It's ours by blood. You can feed her and the brat if you want, Carver, but don't think we'll watch her play mistress of soil that ain't rightfully hers." The air thickened. Sarah felt herself trembling, torn between fury and fear. She wanted to scream that the land had been her husband's dream too, that she had worked those fields with her own blistered hands, that her child had more claim to it than men who had only come to strip it bare. But the words stuck in her throat. Before she could speak, John's hand rested lightly on the post beside her, and his voice cut through the twilight. "This land's mine. She stays." The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke. Eli's eyes narrowed, a glimmer of something darker flashing in them. He leaned back in the saddle, his smirk curling crueler than before. "You want to tie yourself to a widow with a wailing babe, that's your mistake. But don't think blood don't remember. We'll be back, Carver. And when we do, you won't have enough bullets to keep what ain't yours." With that, he jerked the reins, and the riders turned, their laughter carrying off into the fading light like jackals in the distance. Sarah stood shaking, unable to breathe. Her child whimpered, small fists clenching, and tears stung her eyes. But John only stepped closer, adjusting his hat, his face unreadable. "You don't listen to him," he muttered, voice rough with dust and something heavier. "They come here again, they'll answer to me." Then he turned back into the house, leaving Sarah rooted on the porch, caught between disbelief and gratitude that a man who owed her nothing had just declared war for her sake. The next days were filled with a new weight, the kind that sat on shoulders and watched every shadow on the horizon. Sarah worked harder than ever, her baby strapped close as she gathered wood, carried water, tried to patch clothes worn thin. She felt John's eyes on her sometimes, not in judgment, but in that quiet way he had, like he was measuring not her weakness but her strength. He began to show her more of the land, guiding her hand as she drove a plow, steadying her grip when she learned to hold a rifle. He spoke little, but each word carried a strange reassurance, as if he had decided she belonged there long before she dared believe it herself. Still, the fear gnawed. At night she would wake, heart hammering, certain. She heard riders in the dark. She would creep to the crib, lay her hand on her baby's chest to feel the rise and fall, and whisper promises she wasn't sure she could keep. John never spoke of the brothers again, but she saw the way he oiled his rifle more often, the way his eyes lingered on the ridges at sundown. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. One evening, while the child slept, Sarah found herself by the fence watching John mend a post. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and violet, the prairie endless around them. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she said, "I don't understand why you're helping me. You don't owe me anything." He paused, resting his hammer against the wood, and looked at her long enough that her cheeks burned. His voice came quiet, but steady. "Land's just dirt if it don't grow something worth keeping alive. You and the boy, you're worth keeping alive." The words struck her deeper than any kindness she had known. For the first time since the grave closed over her husband, Sarah felt the faint spark of something dangerous, hope. Yet she knew the world would not let her hold it for long. Somewhere out there, her husband's kin were sharpening their spite, and the day was coming when they would test just how much a lone rancher could stand against blood and greed. The day came without without warning. The air was heavy, the horizon smudged with storm clouds, when Sarah heard the drumming of hooves. She stepped out onto the porch, her baby tied close against her chest, and her stomach dropped. The brothers rode hard this time, not with idle threats but with rifles slung across their saddles, dust rising like smoke behind them. Their faces were hard with hunger, not just for land but for power, for the cruel satisfaction of tearing her last shred of hope away. John was already in the yard, his rifle cradled against his arm as naturally as if it had grown there. He didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't waste breath on men who had no ears for reason. He only stood, broad and still, as the riders circled, dust curling around them like snakes. Eli dismounted first, spitting into the dirt. "We warned you, Carver. That land don't belong to a widow. Step aside, and we'll leave you your cattle. Stand in the way, and you'll be buried with her." Sarah's knees trembled, but she lifted her chin. For months she had swallowed their scorn in silence, but something in her broke free. Her voice cracked but carried, "This land was my husband's, and I worked it by his side. My child will know where his father's hands bled into this soil. You'll not take it, not while I breathe." The words surprised even her, burning out of her chest with a strength she didn't know she had. Eli sneered, but for a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes, perhaps the sting of knowing the woman he had cast aside would not bow so easily. John shifted his rifle, the barrel gleaming under the darkening sky. "She stays," he said, his voice low as thunder rolling across the prairie. "And this land stays hers. You want it, you'll have to kill me first." The standoff thickened, the horses stamping nervously, the storm wind carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder. Sarah clutched her child close, every second stretching like eternity, the weight of fate balanced on the twitch of a trigger. Eli's hand hovered over his gun, his brothers fanning out like wolves. Then the sky split. Lightning cracked across the plain, startling the horses, sending them rearing. The sudden chaos tipped the fragile balance, and for a breathless instant, Sarah thought blood would paint the dirt. But John did not flinch. His rifle barked once, the bullet striking the ground inches from Eli's boots, a warning sharp as death itself. Dust spat upward, and Eli froze, rage twisting his face. "You'll regret that, Carver," Eli hissed, his voice dripping venom. "This ain't over." But even as he spat the words, his horse skittered beneath him, and his brothers tugged at their reins. They had seen the calm in John's stance, the certainty that if they pushed further, only corpses would ride away. With curses and snarls, they pulled back, retreating into the storm, their shapes swallowed by the rolling dark. The silence left behind was deafening. Sarah stood rooted, her breath ragged, tears hot on her cheeks as the baby stirred against her chest. John lowered his rifle slowly, shoulders heavy but unbowed, his eyes scanning the horizon long after the riders had gone. When at last he turned, Sarah saw the truth in his face, not anger, not fear, but a quiet resolve carved deep as bedrock. He had chosen, and that choice bound their fates together. That night, when the storm finally broke and rain lashed the windows, John laid a folded paper on the table in front of Sarah. She blinked at it, confused, until he spoke, "Deeds in your name now. The land's yours." Her hands shook as she unfolded it, the ink blurred by her tears. "But why?" she whispered, her voice splintered between awe and disbelief. He leaned back, his gaze steady, words rough as gravel, "Because no woman should be left with nothing. Because you've fought harder for this soil than most men I've known. And because your boy deserves to grow up knowing the land his father dreamed of will be his." The paper felt heavier than iron in her hands. For the first time since death had stolen her husband, Sarah felt the weight lift, the cruel exile, the scorn, the hunger of greedy kin, all washed away by the gift of a man who owed her nothing yet gave her everything. She pressed the deed to her chest, her tears falling freely now, and whispered, "You've given us a life." John only shrugged, his face turning toward the firelight, shadows softening the lines worn deep by years alone. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but you'll make it worth living." Outside, the storm raged, but within the small cabin, something new had taken root. fragile, unspoken, but stronger than fear. It was the promise of land not just tilled for survival, but for love, for a future where a widow and her child would no longer walk in the dust alone. And so, while the world whispered its cruel stories, the prairie carried another, of a woman cast out, of a child born into loss, and of a lone rancher who defied blood and greed to give them a place to stand. A place called home.
The one in the middle was tall, broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that glinted like coins in the dark. His duster coat brushed the planks with each slow breath. On either side of him were men with the hungry look of jackals, one chewing on a toothpick, the other tapping his fingers against the grip of a shotgun. Jack said nothing. The leader's smile widened. "We're not here to talk long. You hand her over, and we walk away. You keep her, and," he let the sentence hang, as if the threat was too obvious to bother finishing. Jack studied them for a bit, then let the door swing shut in their faces. The sound of the bar dropping back into place echoed in the small cabin. For a few seconds, there was silence outside. Then came the boot against the door, a testing shove. Jack moved to the table, picking up his Winchester. Jet away from the door, he called to the woman, but when he glanced back, S.H. was already trying to sit up, her eyes wide. "Tail burn it," S.H. said harshly. "Tail burn it with us inside." Another hard slam shook the frame. Jack grabbed his coat, shrugged into it, and moved toward the window. "Then we won't be inside," he muttered. He crossed the cabin into long strides, hooked his arm under her knees, and lifted her from the bed. S.H. gasped, but her arms instinctively looped around his neck. He pushed through the back door, into the biting night air. The forest swallowed them, moonlight spilling silver across the path as Jack took a narrow trail that led uphill into the rocks. He heard voices behind them now, angry and closing fast. One shouted for the others to circle around. Jack moved like a man who knew every root and stone by memory, his boots sealing on the frozen ground. The woman clung to him, her blood hot against his collar. Her body trembled, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. After 10 minutes of climbing, he ducked into a rocky hollow partially hidden by a fallen pine. He set her down gently against the trunk, crouching beside her. "Stay here," he said. Her hand shot out, gripping his sleeve. "They'll kill you." "Tail 3, he answered, meeting her gaze for just a heartbeat before slipping back toward the trail. The first man came into view moments later, silhouetted against the moonlight. Jack waited until he was close enough to see the whites of his eyes before stepping from cover. The butt of the rifle caught the man square in the jaw, sending him sprawling. Jack grabbed the shotgun from his limp hands and melted back into the shadows before the others could see where the attack had come from. Shouts rang through the trees, and 2 more figures moved uphill, scanning the darknesses. Jack could feel the shift in the night now. The forest itself seemed to close in, the air sharp with tension. He stepped behind them, silent as a ghost, and pressed the shotgun muzzle into the back of the nearest man's neck. "Drop it," he said, and the voice that came out was cold enough to freeze the air between them. The men obeyed. By the time the leader realized they were outflanked, it was too late. Jack had them disarmed and marching down the trail, their own weapons slung over his shoulder. He didn't bother killing them, not yet. Men like this didn't fear death half as much as they feared humiliation. And sending them back empty-handed, beaten by one man, would stir a different kind of trouble. When Jack returned to the hollow, the woman was still there, eyes wide with disbelief. "You drove them off. For now," Jack said, helping her to her feet. "But they'll be back." S.H. looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we can't stay here." He studied her in the pale light, the burn on her shoulders stark even in shadow. Somewhere deep down, he knew S.H. was right. The cabin, his solitude, his quiet life, all of it was gone the moment he cut her down from that tree. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint echo of retreating footsteps. But Jack knew the quiet wouldn't last. It never did.